My son and his wife decided I was to live in the room that used to be my grandmother's sewing room. It was the smallest bedroom in the house my grandmother had built, the one she had left to my son, David, in her will. They called it cozy and manageable. I understood what they meant. They meant it was out of the way. They meant I was out of the way. For the first year after my grandmother Elspeth passed, I lived in that room and tried to make myself smaller, to take up less space, to consume less air. The grief was a physical weight, a thick blanket that muffled the world and made my own limbs feel heavy and disconnected. I moved through the halls of the house where I had spent my happiest childhood summers, and later, the house where I had cared for my grandmother in her final years, and I felt like a ghost in the service of the living. I did their laundry, I did their grocery shopping, I took their dog for walks and picked up their dry cleaning. My daughter-in-law, Sarah, would leave lists on the kitchen counter, written in a crisp, cheerful font on pastel-colored sticky notes. "Eleanor, could you possibly?" They always began. They were never questions. I was 62 years old, a widow myself for over a decade, and I had become an unpaid live-in domestic servant for my only child and his wife. They had good jobs in the city, important jobs they often spoke of in loud, stressed voices over dinner. My work was silent. It was the folded towels that appeared in the linen closet, the gleaming floors, the fully stocked refrigerator. My existence was measured in completed chores, and my reward was the roof over my head. A roof that should have felt like home, but instead felt like a gilded cage I was polishing from the inside. My only solace was the memory of my grandmother. The house was saturated with her. Her scent of lavender and old books still clung to the curtains in the main library. Her worn gardening gloves still sat on the potting bench in the greenhouse. In my small room, I had a rocking chair and a small bookshelf filled with the paperbacks she'd loved, their spines cracked and their pages softened by her touch. I would sit in that chair at night, when the house was finally quiet, and I would remember her voice, the dry wit and the unconditional warmth. She was the only person in my life who had ever seen me completely, not as a function or a role, but as Eleanor. Just Eleanor. And she was gone. The loneliness was a cold, smooth stone in the pit of my stomach. The day of the will reading was 6 months after her funeral. It was a formality, David had said. Everything was straightforward. We all gathered in the conference room of her longtime lawyer, Mr. Henderson. The room was paneled in dark wood and smelled of leather and floor polish. David and Sarah sat together, their hands clasped, looking somber but with an undercurrent of impatience. I sat a little apart from them, my hands folded in my lap. I felt like an accessory they were required to bring along. Mr. Henderson, a man whose quiet dignity always reminded me of my grandmother, adjusted his spectacles and cleared his throat. He read through the legal language, the bequests to distant cousins, the charitable donations. And then he came to the main asset, the house and the bulk of the estate. As expected, it was left to her grandson, David. Sarah let out a small, controlled sigh of relief, a sound she tried to disguise as a sniffle. David squeezed her hand, his face a mask of solemn gratitude. I felt nothing. The house had been David's, a foregone conclusion. I had expected nothing for myself. But then Mr. Henderson read a final clause. He paused, looking over his glasses directly at me for the first time. He said, "To my beloved granddaughter, Eleanor, who was more of a daughter to me than my own, I leave all my personal effects, my jewelry, and a private letter, which I have placed in the top drawer of my writing desk in the library. This letter is for her eyes only." A ripple of something, annoyance perhaps, passed over David's face. Sarah's posture stiffened. A letter? For my eyes only? The air in the room shifted. It was a small thing, a sentimental gesture, but in that sterile, transactional environment, it felt like a disruption. After the meeting on the car ride home, the silence was thick. A letter. Sarah finally said, her voice light but edged with steel. How quaint! I wonder what it says. David glanced at me in the rearview mirror. Probably just old memories, Mom. You know how Grandma was. Sentimental. He said the word sentimental as if it were a mild illness. That evening, I went to the library. The writing desk was a beautiful mahogany piece, its surface polished to a dark gleam. My heart was beating a little faster. This was a message from her, a final word. I felt a tremor of anticipation, a flicker of warmth in the cold emptiness of the past 6 months. I pulled open the top drawer. It was filled with old stationery, dried-up pens, and paper clips. There was no letter. I checked again, my fingers probing every corner, moving aside stacks of envelopes. Nothing. I checked the other drawers, my movements becoming more frantic. It wasn't there. A cold dread began to seep into me. They wouldn't have. They couldn't have. I said nothing. For 2 days, I watched them. I moved through the house with my usual quiet efficiency, but my senses were on high alert. I was no longer a grieving ghost. I was a hunter. I noticed the way David avoided my eyes. I saw the quick conspiratorial glance he exchanged with Sarah when they thought I wasn't looking. They were too cheerful, too solicitous. Are you feeling all right, Eleanor? You seem a bit tired, Sarah would ask, her voice dripping with false concern. I would just nod and continue polishing the silver. The inciting incident, the moment the world fractured, came on the 3rd night. I was heading to my room when I heard their voices from the den, the door slightly ajar. They were speaking in low tones. I stopped, pressing myself against the cool wall in the hallway. Sarah was speaking. Are you sure she doesn't suspect? She's been acting strange. There was a pause, the clink of ice in a glass. Then David's voice, low and dismissive. She's not acting strange, she's just old. She's probably forgotten all about the letter by now. It's better this way. My blood ran cold. I still think we should have just given it to her, Sarah said, a note of anxiety in her voice. What if it was just sentiment, like you said? And what if it wasn't? David shot back, his voice harder now. What if the old woman put something in there about some hidden account, or changed her mind about the house? We couldn't take that risk. Burning it was the only way to be sure. It's ash now. It's done. The house is ours. Everything is ours. Let her have her stupid jewelry. That's more than enough for her. I heard it. I heard it all. Burning it. It's ash now. The words echoed in the silent hallway, in the hollow space in my chest. I didn't make a sound. I backed away from the door, one slow, deliberate step at a time, my hand pressed to my mouth to stifle the sob that was trying to claw its way up my throat. I retreated to my small room, closed the door, and sat down in my grandmother's rocking chair. I didn't cry. The shock was too profound, too crystalline. It was a perfect, terrible clarity. They had not just stolen a letter. They had stolen my grandmother's last words to me. They had taken a moment of connection, of love, and they had burned it for fear of losing a single dollar. They saw me as a threat to be neutralized, a problem to be managed, not a mother, not a person. In that moment, sitting in the dark, I felt the soft blanket of grief burn away, leaving behind something cold, hard, and unyielding. The stone in my stomach was no longer a weight of sorrow. It was a whetstone, and I was sharpening my resolve upon it. The next morning, I began my investigation. It was a quiet, internal process. My actions were the same. I made coffee, I walked the dog, I tidied the kitchen, but my mind was a whirlwind of activity. I replayed my grandmother's last few months in my head, searching for clues, for anything she might have said or done that hinted at this. She had been sharp, lucid, right up until the end. She saw everything. She must have known. She must have known how David and Sarah saw me, how they treated me. The thought was both devastating and galvanizing. My grandmother had not been a fool, and she would not have left her final message to me vulnerable. I remembered Mr. Henderson, his kind, steady gaze at the will reading, the way he had specifically looked at me when he mentioned the letter. for her eyes only. It was a directive, a charge. My family had intercepted it, but the instruction had come from my grandmother through her lawyer. The lawyer. The thought solidified in my mind. He was the key. He had been my grandmother's confidant for over 40 years. He managed her affairs with a meticulousness that she had deeply admired. She trusted him implicitly. If she had a plan, he would be a part of it. Finding his number was easy. I had an old address book of my grandmother's, a worn leather-bound volume I had kept. His office number was listed under H for Henderson. I waited until David and Sarah had left for work. The house was empty, filled with a morning silence that felt different now. It was no longer lonely. It was strategic. I took the cordless phone into my room and closed the door. My hand was shaking slightly as I dialed the number. A polite receptionist answered. I took a breath. "My name is Eleanor Vance," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. "I am the granddaughter of Elspeth Marlowe. I need to schedule an appointment with Mr. Henderson. It's a personal matter regarding my grandmother's estate." The receptionist was efficient. She found a slot for me the following afternoon. "Does Mr. Vance know you are calling?" she asked. "No," I said firmly. "This is a private matter. He is not to be informed." There was a slight pause on the other end, then, "Of course, Mrs. Vance. We'll see you tomorrow at 2. That day and the next morning were a trial of patience. I had to maintain my facade of quiet subservience. I had to smile and nod when Sarah told me about her stressful day at the office. I had to listen as David complained about the stock market. Every word they spoke was filtered through my new knowledge. Their complaints about money, their casual entitlement, their complete blindness to my presence as anything other than a service provider. It all took on a sinister new meaning. I was living in a house with my own child, and he was a stranger, a hostile stranger. I decided to confront them, but not in the way they would expect. I didn't want an argument. I wanted to see their lies up close. That evening, as we sat in the living room, they with their glasses of wine, me with a cup of tea I didn't want, I brought it up. I kept my voice soft, almost hesitant. "David," I began, looking at the teacup in my hands. "I was in the library earlier. I couldn't find that letter Grandma left for me, the one Mr. Henderson mentioned." Sarah's hand, which had been reaching for a magazine, froze mid-air. David cleared his throat. "Oh, right, the letter." He tried for a casual tone, but it was strained. "You know, Mom, I think I saw it. It was just an old card. I think it might have gotten thrown out with some of the old papers from the desk when we were cleaning." He was a terrible liar. His eyes flickered towards the fireplace for a fraction of a second, the fireplace where they burned it. "Thrown out?" I asked, allowing a note of gentle confusion to enter my voice. "But it was for me. Mr. Henderson said so." I looked at him, my expression one of mild distress. I was playing the part they had cast for me, the fragile, slightly confused old woman. Sarah jumped in, her voice smooth as silk. "Eleanor, you know how chaotic it was after the funeral, clearing things out. Things get misplaced. I'm sure David didn't mean for it to be thrown away. It was probably an accident." She placed a hand on my arm, a gesture that was meant to be comforting, but felt like a brand. "Honestly, it was probably just a note saying she loved you. You know she did. You don't need a piece of paper to tell you that." Gaslighting, pure and simple. They were telling me my memory of the event. My feelings about it were invalid. They were patting me on the head and telling me not to worry my pretty little old mind about it. I looked from her placating face to my son's evasive one. I felt a cold fury rise in me, but I pushed it down, deep down. I needed to be calm. "I suppose you're right," I said quietly. It was just her last words to me. I had hoped to read them. I let my voice trail off, letting the sentence hang in the air, heavy with manufactured disappointment. David shifted uncomfortably. "Well, don't dwell on it, Mom. It's not healthy. Grandma would want you to move on." He stood up, ending the conversation. "I'm going to get some work done." I sat there as he walked away. Sarah gave my arm another patronizing pat before following him. I was alone in the grand living room, surrounded by my grandmother's furniture, her paintings, her legacy, and they were telling me to move on. They had committed an act of profound cruelty and disrespect, and their solution was to tell me to forget about it, to pretend it didn't matter. They were trying to erase not only the letter, but my right to even be upset by its destruction. That was their greatest mistake. They underestimated me. They saw a frail, grieving old woman. They had no idea they were looking at a judge. The next day, I took a bus to Mr. Henderson's office. I didn't want to take my car and have them ask where I'd been. The bus ride felt anonymous, freeing. I watched the city slide by, feeling a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years. I arrived a few minutes early and was shown directly into the same dark-paneled conference room. Mr. Henderson came in a moment later. He was holding a thin file. He did not look surprised to see me. "Mrs. Vance," he said, his voice kind, "thank you for coming. I must confess, I have been expecting you." He sat down opposite me and opened the file. "Your grandmother was a very astute woman," he began, his fingers steepled. "She foresaw a number of potential complications." He looked at me, his eyes full of a sad understanding. "You came about the letter, I presume?" I nodded, my throat suddenly tight. "I went to the desk," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "It wasn't there." "No," he said gently. "I did not expect it would be." He slid a document across the table. It was in a protective plastic sleeve. It was a single sheet of my grandmother's familiar cream-colored stationery, covered in her elegant looping handwriting. At the top it read, "A notarized copy for my dear Mr. Henderson in the event of cowardice and greed." My breath caught in my throat. A copy. She had made a copy. "Your grandmother," Mr. Henderson continued, "suspected that her letter to you, which she placed in the desk as a test, might be intercepted and destroyed. She was a keen observer of character, Eleanor. She knew her grandson, and she knew his wife. She drafted this copy and had it notarized and delivered to me 2 weeks before she passed, with very specific instructions." He pushed the file folder towards me. "The letter you are about to read is not just a letter. It is a legal instrument. It is, in essence, the key to her true last will and testament." He let that sink in. A key. A test. My grandmother had laid a trap, and my son, my own son, had walked right into it. I looked down at the copy of the letter, the primary evidence of their betrayal and the proof of my grandmother's undying, strategic love. The gaslighting was over. The truth was here, in this room, waiting to be read. My hands trembled as I reached for the plastic sleeve. The paper inside was a perfect replica of my grandmother's stationery, the weight and texture familiar even through the protective covering. Mr. Henderson gave me a small, encouraging nod. "Take your time, Eleanor," he said softly. I slid the page out. The ink was a dark blue, the handwriting a graceful, forward-slanting script that I had known my entire life. It felt as if she were in the room with me. I took a deep breath and began to read. "My dearest Eleanor," it began, "if you are reading this in Mr. Henderson's office, then my worst fears have come to pass. It means David and his wife found the original letter I left for you, and, in their infinite greed and suspicion, they destroyed it. Do not mourn the loss of that piece of paper, my love. Mourn the character of the people who felt it necessary to burn my last words to you. Their action is the final signature on a contract of their own making, and it confirms everything I have suspected for the last 5 years." I had to stop and reread that sentence. 5 years. She had been watching and worrying for 5 years. I had thought my role as their unpaid servant had begun after her death, but she had seen its inception long before. She had seen the subtle shift in their behavior, the growing sense of entitlement, the way they began to treat my presence in her house as a given, a convenience. I continued reading, my heart aching with a mixture of sorrow and a fierce, vindicating love for this woman who had seen me so clearly. "I have watched them," the letter went on. "I have watched how they speak to you when they think I am not listening. I have seen the lists left on the counter, the passive-aggressive sighs when a chore is not completed to their immediate satisfaction. They have mistaken your kindness for weakness, your grief for senility. They have moved into my house and treated you, my darling granddaughter, like an inconvenient piece of the furniture that came with the property. I tried to speak to David about it once. I asked him if he appreciated all you did for us. He smiled and said, 'Of course, Grandma, Mom's a saint.' He said it with the same casual air one uses to praise a reliable appliance. A tear escaped and traced a slow, hot path down my cheek. A reliable appliance. That was how my son saw me. The accuracy of her observation was a physical blow. She had heard the exact tone, understood the precise nature of their dismissiveness. She had seen me, truly seen me, even as I was trying to make myself invisible. "I cannot, in good conscience," the letter continued, and here her handwriting seemed to become firmer, more resolute, "leave my legacy in the hands of a man who treats his own mother with such profound disrespect. The will that was read in this office, the one leaving the house and the majority of my assets to David, was a decoy, a piece of theater. It was contingent upon one simple, unwritten condition, that he prove himself a decent human being by honoring my simple request to pass a private letter to his mother. By destroying that letter, he has voided his inheritance. He has failed the only test that ever mattered." I looked up at Mr. Henderson, my eyes wide with disbelief. Voided his inheritance. The words seemed to hang in the air, shimmering with impossible power. He was watching me, his expression unreadable, but for the deep sympathy in his eyes. "It's all legally sound, Eleanor," he said quietly. "The primary will contain a specific clause, number 7, subsection B, which we skipped during the initial reading at my discretion, as per your grandmother's written instructions. It states that the full inheritance designated for David Vance is conditional upon the successful delivery of the personal correspondence to you. This notarized letter, combined with your testimony that you never received the original, is the legal trigger. It activates your grandmother's true will, which I also have here." He tapped another thicker folder on the table. The true will. My mind was reeling. This wasn't just a letter, it was a bombshell. My grandmother hadn't just left me a message, she had left me an entire future. I turned back to the page, my fingers gripping the edges. "Therefore, Eleanor, my true and final will is this. Everything that was designated for David in the decoy will. The house, the surrounding land, the investment portfolio, the liquid assets, everything. I leave to you, unconditionally. It is all yours. I bought this land and built this house with my own hands and my own money. It is mine to give, and I give it to the only person who has ever truly valued love over property. I give it to you, my dear girl. It is your home now, in law as it has always been in your heart." I broke down then. The sobs I had been holding back since I overheard them in the den finally came. A flood of grief and shock and overwhelming, gut-wrenching gratitude. I wept for my grandmother's fierce, protective love. I wept for the years I had spent feeling small and worthless. I wept for the son I had lost, not to death, but to a poverty of spirit so profound he would burn his mother's inheritance for a few pieces of silver. It was the emotional nadir, the lowest point, to see the full scope of their betrayal laid bare, to understand it was not a recent development but a deep-seated rot, was devastating. My entire family structure, the very foundation of my life, was a lie. My son did not love me. He tolerated me. He used me. And my grandmother had known it all. Mr. Henderson waited patiently, pushing a box of tissues across the table. He didn't speak. allowing me the space to feel the full, crushing weight of it all. I cried until I was empty, until there were no more tears left. And then something shifted. The storm of emotion passed, and in its wake was a profound and unnerving calm. It was the moment of clarity. The grief had burned itself out, and what remained was cold, hard, and clear as glass. The weeping, broken woman who had entered this office was gone. In her place was someone else, someone I hadn't met in a very long time. I wiped my eyes and pushed the tissue box away. I looked at Mr. Henderson, my gaze steady. "What do we do now?" I asked. My voice was different. The tremor was gone. It was quiet, but it was solid. The letter had one final paragraph. I read it aloud, my new voice giving the words the weight they deserved. "Live in that house, Eleanor. Fill it with light and laughter and the smell of baking bread, the way it was when you were a little girl. Do not let the memory of their greed taint a single room. This is not an act of revenge. Revenge is a hot, messy, pointless emotion. This, my dear, is an act of correction. It is an act of justice, and it is my final gift to you, the freedom to be the lady of your own house. Do not be afraid. You are stronger than any of them. With all my love, forever, your grandmother, Elspeth." I folded the letter carefully and slid it back into its protective sleeve. A correction, an act of justice. My grandmother had given me not just an inheritance, but a mission. She had armed me with the truth and the law. The path forward was no longer shrouded in the fog of grief. It was a straight, clear line. I was done crying. I was done being small. I was done waiting. What came next would be a reckoning, a quiet, orderly, and absolute reckoning. I looked at Mr. Henderson, the last vestiges of my tears drying on my face. A profound sense of purpose settled over me, a quiet hum of energy where the hollow ache of grief had been. "She called it a correction," I said, my voice low and even. "I want to honor that. I want to execute her true wishes, completely." The decision was made. It was not a choice born of anger or a desire for vengeance. It was simpler than that. It was a matter of alignment. My grandmother had set a crooked thing straight, and my role was to see it through. I was no longer a passive victim of my family's cruelty. I was now the active executor of my grandmother's will. Mr. Henderson nodded slowly, a deep respect in his eyes. He had known my grandmother for decades, and in that moment, I think he saw her in me. The same steel core beneath a quiet exterior. "Very well, Eleanor," he said, his tone shifting from comforting to professional. "Let's discuss strategy." He pulled the thicker folder towards him, the one labeled True Last Will and Testament of Elspeth Marlowe, and opened it. The air in the room became charged with the gravity of what we were about to do. This was no longer about feelings. It was about logistics. The first step, he explained, is to file this true will with the probate court, along with a petition to have it supersede the previous document. The petition will include your sworn affidavit testifying that you never received the letter mentioned in the initial will, and it will include the notarized copy of the letter from your grandmother as evidence of her intent and the conditional nature of the first will. He laid out the documents, his long fingers tapping on each one as he spoke. The legal precedent is strong. A conditional bequest that fails its condition is null and void. Their destruction of the letter is an explicit failure of that condition. I listened, absorbing every word. It felt strangely empowering to be discussing legal petitions and affidavits. For so long, my world had been circumscribed by shopping lists and laundry schedules. Now it was about motions and evidence. "What will happen when they find out?" I asked, not out of fear, but out of a need to understand the full picture. "They will be formally notified," Mr. Henderson said calmly. "David will receive a legal notice that his status as beneficiary is being challenged and is likely to be revoked. He will have the opportunity to contest it, of course. He paused, looking at me. He will almost certainly lie. He will claim he gave you the letter, or that it was lost accidentally. It will be his word against yours. But we have your grandmother's notarized foresight on our side. The very existence of the copy, with her explicit reasoning, is powerful evidence that she anticipated his dishonesty. It paints a very clear picture for a judge. We spent the next hour going through the details. Mr. Henderson was my professional ally, my guide through this new, complex territory. He was sharp, unemotional, and incredibly competent. He listened without judgment as I recounted the conversation I had overheard, the gaslighting, the years of subtle and not so subtle disrespect. He simply took notes, his pen scratching quietly on a legal pad. Each detail I provided was not a complaint. It was evidence. It was context for the formal case we were building. The house is the most significant asset, he continued, turning a page in the file. According to this true will, your grandmother left the deed to the property directly to you. It's held in a trust that this will now activates. The transfer of title is relatively straightforward once the will is validated. Essentially, Eleanor, you will become their landlord. The word hung in the air. Landlord? Me. The woman who lived in the sewing room, a small dark flicker of irony so bleak it was almost humorous, sparked within me. We need to move methodically, he advised. First, the court filing. Then, while the probate process is underway, we can begin the process of transferring the liquid assets and investments into a new account under your control. Your grandmother was very thorough. She established a new trust for you, separate from everything else, to be funded upon the execution of this will. We will freeze the estate account that David currently has access to, citing the legal challenge. It will cut off his access to her funds immediately. Freezing the accounts, reporting the challenge, transferring the deed. Each action was a quiet, legal, and devastating blow. It was a systematic dismantling of the life my son and his wife had built on a foundation of lies and my unpaid labor. With Mr. Henderson's help, I was gathering the formal, irrefutable evidence of their betrayal. We had the notarized letter. We had the true will. We had my testimony. We had a detailed timeline of their deception, corroborated by my grandmother's own words. The trap she had set was not just a test of character. It was a perfectly constructed legal cage. I left his office that afternoon feeling taller. The world looked different. The colors of the city seemed brighter, the air crisper. I was no longer drifting. I was moving with purpose. I took the bus home, and as I walked up the long driveway to the house, I saw it with new eyes. It wasn't their house where I was permitted to live. It was my house, my grandmother's house, my home. The knowledge settled deep in my bones, a solid, unshakable truth. That night, at dinner, I was a different person. Outwardly, I was the same. I served the meal I had cooked. I listened to their chatter. But inwardly, I was a silent observer, a strategist watching her opponents from across a chessboard. When Sarah mentioned needing to book a lavish vacation, we deserve a break. It's been such a stressful year. I just nodded, a faint, unreadable smile on my lips. When David complained about a dip in the market affecting his portfolio, I felt a profound cold distance. It wasn't his portfolio, not anymore. They were living in a house of cards, and a great quiet wind was coming for them. They had no idea. They continued to see me as a ghost, a shadow in the corner of their lives. They never noticed the shadow was starting to take shape. They never noticed the judge was already holding the gavel. The weeks that followed were a masterclass in quiet patience. While Mr. Henderson and his team worked behind the scenes, filing motions and preparing documents, my life at home continued on its familiar track. I maintained my routine with a placid, almost serene demeanor. I folded David's shirts, noting the expensive fabric with a detached air. I polished the silver platters that Sarah used for her dinner parties, the ones she would soon no longer have. Each domestic act felt like a final, silent farewell to the woman I used to be. I was not resentful. I felt a strange sense of peace, the calm that comes from knowing a great and necessary change is in motion. My son and his wife noticed a difference in me, but they misinterpreted it completely. They saw my newfound calm as resignation, as a sign that I had finally moved on from the matter of the letter, just as they had instructed. "Mom seems to be in a better mood lately," I heard David say to Sarah one evening. "See? I told you she just needed to get over it." Their arrogance was a shield, blinding them to the reality of their situation. They saw what they wanted to see, a compliant, forgetful old woman settling back into her place. The first legal maneuver struck without warning. Mr. Henderson called me one Tuesday morning after David and Sarah had left for work. "The petition has been accepted by the court, Eleanor," he said, his voice crisp, "and the motion to freeze the estate's primary assets has been granted, pending the probate hearing. The funds are now inaccessible to him." I felt a quiet thrum of power. The first wall of their fortress had been breached. That evening, the first crack appeared in their facade. David came home late, his face pale and tight with anger. He threw his briefcase onto a chair. "Can you believe this?" he snapped at Sarah, not even acknowledging my presence as I stood by the kitchen counter. "The bank called. They've frozen Grandma's main account. Some kind of administrative hold, they said. It's ridiculous. I have bills to pay." Sarah looked alarmed. "What? Why? Can they do that?" "It has to be a mistake," David fumed, pacing the length of the room. "I'll get on the phone with Henderson tomorrow and sort this out. Unbelievable incompetence." He was still blind. He assumed it was a bureaucratic error, not a targeted strike. I simply continued wiping down the counter, my movements slow and deliberate. The official notice arrived 2 days later. It was delivered by a courier who required a signature. David signed for the thick envelope, his brow furrowed in annoyance. He tore it open in the foyer. I watched from the doorway of the living room as he read the first page. I saw the color drain from his face. He swayed slightly as if he'd been struck. "Sarah," he croaked, his voice thin and reedy. "Sarah, get in here, now." Sarah came running, her expression one of alarm. He handed her the papers. She read them, her eyes growing wider with each line. Her perfectly composed face crumbled into a mask of disbelief and fury. Finally, she looked up, and her eyes, blazing with hatred, found me. "You!" she hissed. "This is you. What did you do?" I said nothing. I just stood there, my hands clasped in front of me, waiting. The moment I had been preparing for had arrived. David turned to me, his face a mottled red. "What is this, Mom? What is this garbage? Contesting the will? Failure of condition? What have you been telling Henderson?" His voice rose with each question, escalating into a shout. "Did you lie to him? Did you tell him I didn't give you the letter?" This was the final confrontation. It was not a plea for understanding or a negotiation. It was the delivery of a verdict. I took a calm step into the foyer. Mr. Henderson had advised me on this part specifically. Do not argue. Do not defend. Simply inform. "The will you heard read was conditional, David," I said, my voice quiet but carrying in the sudden silence of the house. "It was contingent on you giving me Grandma's letter. You didn't. You burned it. I know you did." "That's a lie," he roared, taking a step toward me. It was lost." "An accident!" Sarah rushed to his side, her hand on his arm. "She's confused, David. She's making things up. Eleanor, you are senile. How dare you try to steal from your own son?" Their disbelief was genuine. They could not comprehend that I, the quiet, compliant woman they had so thoroughly dismissed, could be capable of such a decisive, strategic action. They still saw me as the problem, as the one who was confused or malicious. It doesn't matter what you say now, I continued, my voice remaining level, cutting through their rising panic. Grandma knew you would do this. She knew you would lie. That's why she left a notarized copy with her lawyer, a copy that explains everything. I paused, letting the weight of that information crush them. The court has accepted it. The true will is now being probated. This house, the money, everything. She left it all to me. The silence that followed was absolute. It was a silence born of pure shock, of a world turned completely upside down. David stared at me, his mouth slightly open, the rage on his face slowly being replaced by a dawning, sickening horror. Sarah looked as if she might faint. Her entire life, her social standing, her financial security, it was all evaporating before her eyes. Then came the pleading. "Mom, no!" David whispered, his voice cracking. "You can't. This is my home, our home. Please, Mom, we can fix this. We'll share it. We can work something out." Sarah, seeing that aggression had failed, switched tactics. Tears welled in her eyes. "Eleanor, please, think about what you're doing. Tearing the family apart over some misunderstanding. Your grandmother would be horrified." This was the moment, the severing. I looked at my son, at his desperate, pleading face, and I felt nothing but a vast, cold distance. The love I'd had for the boy he was had long since been eroded by the man he had become. "She would not be horrified," I said, and my voice was as cold and clear as a winter morning. In fact, she told me what to do. She wrote, "This is not an act of revenge. This is an act of correction." And that's what this is. Quoting her letter, the one they had turned to ash, was the final devastating blow. It was irrefutable proof. I knew everything. I turned away from them then. My part was done. As I walked towards the living room, I pulled my phone from my pocket. I had pre-arranged this with Mr. Henderson. I dialed his number. "It's done," I said quietly. "They know." He replied, "I'm on my way, Eleanor, and I am not coming alone. There is an eviction notice to be served." I hung up and sat down in my grandmother's favorite armchair. I could hear Sarah begin to sob hysterically in the foyer. I heard David shouting, then his voice breaking. I did not go to them. I did not feel a shred of pity. I simply sat, and I waited for the quiet, orderly sound of justice arriving at my door. The aftermath was not as dramatic as one might imagine. There was no grand explosion, no final, tearful confrontation. It was more like a slow, quiet sinking. Mr. Henderson arrived with a uniformed sheriff's deputy, a man with a calm, impassive face. The presence of the law enforcement officer had an immediate and sobering effect. Sarah's hysterics subsided into choked, angry sobs. David's pleading turned into a sullen, defeated silence. They were presented with the formal eviction notice. It gave them 30 days to vacate the property. My property. They did not speak to me for the remainder of that first day. They retreated to their master suite, a room I had cleaned for them hundreds of times, and shut the door. I could hear their muffled voices, rising and falling in tones of panic and accusation. I made myself a simple dinner of toast and tea and ate it in the kitchen, the room suddenly feeling vast and silent. It wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was a clean silence. The oppressive weight of their expectations, their demands, their constant low-level disappointment in me, it was gone. The house could finally breathe, and so could I. The 30 days were a strange, tense ballet of avoidance. They hired movers. They packed boxes. They spoke only when necessary, their words clipped and cold. They tried to appeal to me through others. My sister called, David's aunt. She told me I was being cruel and unnatural. "He's your son, Eleanor. How can you throw your own son out on the street?" I listened patiently, and then I said, "He is a 40-year-old man with a 6-figure income. He is not being thrown on the street. He is being asked to leave my house." I did not explain further. I did not justify myself. I simply stated the fact and ended the call. Their friends, People I had served canapés to at a dozen dinner parties stopped looking me in the eye when we passed in the local grocery store. I was the villain in their story, the cold-hearted matriarch who had stolen her poor son's inheritance. I found I didn't care. Their opinions were meaningless. They had never seen me anyway, only the role I played. The consequences for David and Sarah were swift and brutal. Without access to my grandmother's fortune, their lavish lifestyle collapsed. They had been living far beyond their means, using the estate's capital to finance their cars, their vacations, their designer clothes. The frozen account was a shock to their system, from which they could not recover. They had to sell Sarah's expensive car. They had to cancel their country club membership. The social disgrace, I heard through the town grapevine, was profound. They were forced to rent a small, generic apartment in a complex by the highway, a place Sarah had once referred to as depressing. The financial ruin was complete. They had built their entire world on a foundation they did not own, and I had simply reclaimed my property. On their last day in the house, I stayed in my small room, the one they had assigned to me. I heard the movers tramping through the halls. I heard the truck pull away. A few minutes later, I heard their car start and drive down the long gravel driveway for the last time. When I was sure they were gone, I walked out. The house was a mess of packing debris and empty spaces where their furniture had been, but it was my mess, my empty space. I walked through the grand living room, my footsteps echoing in the emptiness. I ran my hand along the mahogany writing desk in the library, the one where the test had been laid. I felt no triumph, no vengeful glee. I felt only a vast, quiet, and somber sense of resolution. It was done. The correction was complete. My emotional state in the weeks that followed was one of strange, peaceful distance. I did not celebrate. I did not gloat. The whole affair felt less like a victory and more like a necessary, painful surgery. I had excised a rot from my life. The process had been agonizing, but the result was health. The result was peace. I spent my days cleaning the house from top to bottom, not as a chore, but as a ritual. I scrubbed away the last vestiges of their presence. I opened all the windows, letting the fresh air chase out the stale energy of their resentment and entitlement. The house was no longer heavy. It felt light. It felt mine. I received a single hate-filled letter from Sarah about a month after they left. It accused me of being a monster, of destroying her life out of jealousy and spite. I read it once, then I put it in the fireplace, the same fireplace where they had burned my grandmother's letter, and I watched it turn to ash. That, I thought, was enough. I ignored their calls. I returned mail addressed to them. I maintained my new boundaries with a silence that was more powerful than any argument. I did not owe them an explanation. I did not owe them forgiveness. I owed them nothing. My only duty was to myself and to the memory of the woman who had given me back my life. A year has passed since David and Sarah drove down the driveway for the last time. The house is transformed. It is no longer a showroom for their social ambitions. It is a home, my home. I moved out of the small sewing room and into the master bedroom, the one with the large windows that overlook the gardens. In the mornings, the sun streams in, and I wake up not to a list of chores, but to the sound of birdsong. The heavy, oppressive silence has been replaced by the quiet hum of a life being lived on its own terms. I have reclaimed my old hobbies, the parts of myself I had packed away to make room for their needs. I spend hours in my grandmother's greenhouse, my hands deep in the rich soil. My grandmother's gardening gloves, once a sad memento, are now worn and dirty from my own work. The kitchen, once a place of thankless servitude, now perpetually smells of baking bread and lemon cake. I bake not because I have to, but because I want to. I give loaves away to my neighbors and eat slices of cake for breakfast if I feel like it. The freedom is in these small, quiet rebellions against my former life. The house feels lighter, happier. It is breathing again. I am not entirely alone. My cousin Lily, my aunt's youngest daughter, has become a regular visitor. She's in her late 20s, a gentle, artistic soul who is always on the periphery of the family, too quiet and observant for the loud, grasping personalities of David and Sarah. She had reached out to me after she heard what happened, not with condemnation, but with a simple 4-word text message. "Good for you, Eleanor." She had seen it all, too. She had seen how I was treated, how I had diminished myself over the years. Now she comes for lunch every Sunday. We sit in the garden my grandmother planted, and I am now tending, and we talk for hours. She tells me about her art, her dreams. I tell her stories about her great-aunt Elspeth, about the history of the house, about the woman who built it. Our relationship is not based on obligation or transaction. It is built on mutual respect, shared laughter, and genuine affection. In Lily, I see the same spark of integrity and kindness that I saw in my grandmother. She sees me not as an appliance or a function, but as Eleanor. She is the worthy successor, the loyal remnant of a family that had otherwise lost its way. She is my new family, a small, honest, and healthy one. Sometimes, when I'm alone in the house at night, sitting in my grandmother's rocking chair, I think about what I've learned. I've learned that family is not just a matter of blood. It is a matter of respect. It is a matter of seeing the other person, truly seeing them, in all their humanity. Love is not obligation. It is not a list of chores on a sticky note. It is a quiet, steady presence that wishes for your happiness as much as its own. I learned that it is never too late to reclaim your life. For years, I believed my story was over. I was a widow, a mother whose child had grown, an old woman living on the charity of her family. I had accepted my role as a ghost in my own life, but my grandmother, with her fierce, strategic love, reminded me that I was the author of my own story, and I had the power to write a new ending. I refused to be erased. I refused to be silenced. This journey was not about revenge. It was about truth. It was about choosing myself, choosing my dignity, over the comfortable lie of a family that did not value me. And in the end, I found a profound peace not in the company of others, but in solitude and in truth. My life is quiet now. It is steady. It is my own, and it is more than enough. So if you are listening to this, and if any part of my story echoes something in your own, I want you to know this. You are not invisible. Your kindness is not a weakness. And you are never too old, and it is never too late to become the lady of your own house. I hope you share this story with someone who needs to hear it. I hope you leave a comment if it stirred something in you, or you can simply sit with it for a while. I promise you, that is enough.